I'm going to share today some of the lessons from our work on refugee education for the current pandemic, and in particular, what it means to educate within and for uncertainty. I'd like to talk today about these gaps between present experiences and future opportunities in terms of refugee education specifically, but also in terms of its lessons for the kinds of unknowable futures and the uncertainty that increasing number of children and young people now experience as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the end of last year, over 250 million children were out of school, and almost half of those children lived in conflict settings. But over the course of this pandemic, almost all of the almost 2 billion school-age children globally will have experienced school closures and disruptions. So we know that education is fundamentally about learning who we are and how we belong in the world. In situations of uncertainty, we find that education can have the power to create and remake conceptions of home, of belonging, of security, and of possibilities for the future, but also that it has the power to exclude and to erode a sense of belonging, really destroying this idea of what home is. So in our work, we focus on these 4 ways that education can create opportunity, that it can alter trajectories of conflict, build strong communities, prepare young people for unknowable futures, and that it can foster cohesion and belonging. But of course, like with all big questions, the real question is how it can do these things. So positive peace is the absence of structural violence. It shows up as unequal power and consequently unequal life chances. That's the structural violence. So positive peace is not only about the absence of violence, but also the presence of conditions that can allow individuals to access equal opportunities. We often find that refugees are initially searching for a kind of negative peace, an absence of direct violence, but quickly learning that it is the elements of positive peace that can provide the opportunities that they're looking for, particularly through education. We find that recognition to address identity-based inequalities really cuts to the core of what is a fundamental tension in education between standardized approaches and autonomous kind of approaches that are centered more within local communities, within schools, and within classrooms. And I think this tension really comes to the fore in pandemic education. So we need to think about what are the trade-offs between the autonomy needed for recognition and education that would enable full participation for all. We see lessons from refugee education for the current pandemic. And at core, they're lessons about what education for uncertainty can productively include. And they fall into a few buckets, in particular related to the nature of disruption and the purposes of education, and then more kind of action steps related to learning to live with uncertainty, developing capacities for critical thinking, and creating belonging and welcoming communities. But if we talk about this first dimension, the nature of disruption, we find that most people experiencing disruption as a result of crisis, in our case, in our work, mostly through conflict and migration, imagine that this disruption will be short-lived. But the average conflict lasts between 10 and 25 years. This doesn't mean that schools are closed, as they are in many places now during the pandemic, for all of that time. But I think the main point and lesson for our current situation is that while we think school disruptions will be short-lived, they're almost always longer than we anticipate. And of course, conflict and pandemics are really different situations, but it's the unpredictability of when schools will close, of when they may open, that I think is quite similar. The reactions of individuals to reopening schools, we also find can vary depending on experiences. So one of my students, Zura Faizi, has been doing field-based work in Afghanistan, and her interviews with young people who've experienced a bombing in their school make clear how hard it is to return when school represents fear. And I think we need to think about how this may be true for COVID-19 as well, both in terms of how families think about school participation if they have experienced illness, and how they think about it if the risks are greater for some children, given any constellation of factors. The second kind of dimension of lessons is really around the purposes of education. And I think as this long-term nature of uncertainty sets in for us in the current pandemic, we need to think not only about what is immediate and life-saving, but also about what is life-sustaining. This idea of not what keeps us alive and safe for the moment, but what makes it worthwhile to be alive. We see from refugee settings that in situations of uncertainty, there really is a critical role for teachers in helping young people learn to live with uncertainty rather than fight against it. The future of learning and the future of many parts of our lives may look very different in the near and longer term future. And as parents and as teachers, we can help our young people to navigate this uncertainty by helping them to know that we trust them and will help to guide them and work with them together to build futures that are still hopeful, that are still equitable and productive and fun, and that education can be a central tool in that collective future building. In refugee settings, we find that children who learn about histories of conflict and reasons for their displacement are better able to cope with uncertainty, to learn, and also to plan for the future. They need to understand why they had to flee their homes, the origins of the kinds of discrimination that they faced in their countries of origin, but also often in exile, as they try to build a new life, understanding these kinds of inequalities and discrimination. As we think about the pandemic, it's important for children to understand why their schools are closed, why they need to socially distance, and the kind of action role that they can play in preventing the spread of COVID-19. In the array of actions by teachers globally now to connect with students during this pandemic through materials dropped off to homes, to phone calls, videos, online classes, really echo what we see in longer-term situations of disruption that serve to build a shared sense of stability and belonging that's needed to thrive in uncertainty, and that needs to persist beyond an emergency phase, but to be brought in to longer-term solutions.